Hello everybody, this is your Professor Joseph Holbrook in REL 3106. We're studying religion in Latin America, and I'm recording this particular video specifically for the graduate students. I'm doing a series on social theory for religious studies, including an assortment of review essays and literature reviews, as well as summaries of theoretical positions. And I can't remember if this is week 6 or week 7, but we're getting into it. So today we're going to talk about a review essay written by an author named David Smilde, or Smilde, I'm not quite sure how it's pronounced, in the History of Religions journal. It's always important to notice what journals your sources are in, so that if you find them useful and helpful, you can go back to that journal and perhaps look for more. Also, if you ever get to the point where you want to publish, depending on the kind of material you want to publish, it's good to be familiar with the relevant peer-reviewed journals for your field. So without further ado, let me share my screen and go to my notes for David Smilde. And over here, there. These notes are a bit rough, so bear with me. So this is a review essay of Smilde's article, which is titled Evangelicals and Politics in Latin America, Moving Beyond Monolithic Portraits. And all three of these books that he reviews have a common theme of comparative study or comparative analysis. One of the things that's useful about a comparative analysis, which I did for both my master's thesis and my doctoral dissertation, I did comparative studies, is that you can draw out information, comparisons, contrasts in very helpful ways with a comparative study that you can't with studying a single case. Sometimes in comparative study you have two different situations with a similar outcome, in which case you ask yourself, what do these two cases have in common that produces the same outcome? Or you might have two vastly different situations or you might have two similar situations with a very different outcome, in which case you ask yourself, what do these two cases have in contrast that might bring about a different income? I did my doctoral dissertation I did on Brazil and Cuba, and I studied a particular Catholic youth organization in both countries that had very different final outcomes. And of course, Brazil and Cuba had slavery in common, but in terms of language and the size of the countries, they're very unsimilar. And also there was a very different, at the end of the 40-year period I studied, Cuba was taken over by a Marxist regime under Castro, and Brazil came under a right-wing military dictatorship, which were very different geopolitical circumstances. So I drew some conclusions from that. In my master's thesis, I also did a comparative study of Brazil and Colombia in terms of religious pluralism and democracy. So there's a lot to be said for comparative studies. So Smilde is reviewing a book by Brian H. Smith, which we're going to spend a little more time with later, called Religious Politics in Latin America, Pentecostal versus Catholic. And so what Smith is doing in his book is he's comparing Catholicism to Pentecostalism and their political outworkings in Latin America. So he's doing a big macro view. He's comparing all of Catholicism in Latin America with all of Pentecostalism in Latin America and drawing some conclusions out of that. It's very well done. One of the criticisms that Smilde offers is that he treats Catholicism and Pentecostalism as monolithic. In other words, Pentecostalism versus Catholicism, and he compares and contrasts them. You could call that something like Max Weber's ideal types. However, as Smilde points out, there are multiple Catholicisms in Latin America: popular Catholicism, charismatic Catholicism, traditional or elite Catholicism, and there's liberation theology in Catholicism, and then there's variations country by country. And then with Pentecostalism, it's the same thing. There's no one Pentecostalism in all of Latin America. Brazilian Pentecostalism may be very different than Guatemalan Pentecostalism, and even in with Brazil and Guatemala, you have dozens of competing Pentecostal groups with different theologies, different practices. So that's a criticism of Smith's book. Paul Preston does a different kind of comparison, which Smilde is full of praise for both Smith and Preston's books and the subtlety of their arguments and their analysis. Preston's book is called Evangelicals and Politics in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, and as the title may give you a hint, he is doing a different kind of comparison, where he's comparing Pentecostalism and their involvement in politics in certain countries in Latin America with, I believe it's South Korea and one other country, an African country. So that gives you a different kind of comparative analysis. When I did my master's thesis on democracy and religious pluralism in Latin America, I compared Brazil, which is very pluralistic, with Colombia, which was very hegemonic at that time, almost uniformly Catholic, with strong persecution of evangelicals. But I could have done a study of Brazil and compared it to Saudi Arabia as another hegemonic religious culture where there's an absence of pluralism. And I probably would have teased out different aspects of that. And then Timothy Steigenga, The Politics of the Spirit, the Political Implications of Pentecostalized Religion in Costa Rica and Guatemala. And Steigenga is an example of a different kind of comparative study yet again, unlike Brian Smith, where Smith is studying monolithic Catholicism in Latin America and monolithic Pentecostalism in Latin America. Steigenga is studying only Pentecostalism, but he's comparing Pentecostalism in Costa Rica with Guatemala, which have very different geopolitical contexts. And it comes up with some interesting insights that Smith and Preston would not have gotten in their analysis. So that's the value of comparative studies. And I'm doing good here. So in his review, Smilde talks a little bit about Max Weber and Eli Haleve and their classic scholarship, which contributed to modernization theory. When he says that Pentecostalism has been associated with capitalistic economic growth and open democratic politics by some recent scholars, beginning with in the 1960s, especially scholars who are favorable to the modernization theory, which has its weaknesses as well as strengths. And these same scholars tend to associate Catholicism with semi-feudal economics and authoritarian politics. On the other hand, you have the development of Latin American liberation theology within Catholicism in the 1960s, although it did also have some influence in mainstream Protestantism. And this emphasized this worldly readings of the Bible. Now, when they use the term this worldly, he's referring to some of Max Weber's ideal types about otherworldly salvation versus this worldly salvation, otherworldly asceticism versus this worldly asceticism. And so Latin American liberation theology tends to focus on this worldly readings of the Bible. In other words, how can this story in the Bible apply to my current economic situation with my employer? That's one example. and he reviews the trajectory of liberation theology, including what he calls the painful decline in the 1980s, which we haven't really discussed yet. That was a combination of political terror and oppression that were brought against activist priests in the church in places like Argentina in the late 1970s. Also with an attempt by the Vatican to shut down and control liberation theology and to eliminate some of the Marxist influences undertaken by John Paul II. And we may get into more of that later in this course. So he points out two other, backing up, at the same time that liberation theology was undergoing a painful decline, the competitor for the SEBs, the Comunidades Eclesiales de Base, or the Christian-based communities, were competing with evangelical or Pentecostal churches. I probably should say something about the distinctions between evangelical and Pentecostal, but maybe you all can remind me to talk about that. All Pentecostals pretty much are evangelicals, but not all evangelicals are Pentecostals. And both evangelicals and Pentecostals are all Protestants, but certainly not all Protestants are that. So they're substreams within a stream, if that's making any sense. So he mentions Emilio Willems and David Martin. David Martin is one of my favorites. He's a British sociologist who saw Protestant evangelicalism as supporting individualism and autonomy and extrapolated democratic trends from this growth. I'm having trouble keeping my cigar going today. Then there are other scholars who took a different point of view. These are back in the 60s. Christian Lalave Dispene and Jean-Pierre Bastien argued that there was little resemblance between the current Pentecostalized and evangelicalism growing in Latin America and the type of Protestantism that had fomented democracy in the early stages of British and U.S. industrialization. For that matter, the Protestantism embraced by Republicans in late 19th century Latin America. Now, it's not talking about our current Republican Party. He's talking about the liberals in Latin America who were trying to modernize their countries in the 19th century Latin America. And actually, I think this would include Simón de Bolívar, who wanted to encourage Protestant missionaries to come and open schools in an attempt to break the stranglehold or the monopoly of the Catholic Church over education, and also many of them thought that Protestantism was more forward-looking and more rational than Catholicism. Their reasons were social and political, not religious. So, then he goes in more detail on Brian Smith's book, which we're going to go over in a few weeks. We're going to go through his chapters because it's a very small book and it's not a hard read. We'll go through it as an example of a comparative study that is trying to discern where do we go from here, what's the future hold for Latin America, what effect will Pentecostalism have on Latin American work ethic, economics. We're going to be going through that, and I'll be posting PDFs of this. That's about all I have. I think I made it a little bit early today, so I guess the key concept for today is comparative study. And I encourage you to read this review essay and continue with your research. Good to talk to you. I'll see you today at 5 p.m. and answer any questions you might have. Good day, and take